Moments ago, the Supreme Court issued a 6-3 ruling that just struck down key gun restrictions in America, and the implications of this decision are absolutely massive. This is not a minor procedural ruling or a narrow technical decision that only affects a handful of people. This is a major constitutional moment that affects millions of gun owners across the country and fundamentally changes how the Second Amendment is interpreted and applied. The Supreme Court has spoken, and with a decisive 6-3 majority, they've ruled that certain gun restrictions that have been in place for years, in some cases decades, cannot stand under the Constitution. This ruling immediately transforms how Second Amendment rights are protected, what restrictions the government can and cannot impose, and how future gun control measures will be evaluated by courts at every level. Right now, gun rights advocates are celebrating this as one of the most significant victories in modern Second Amendment history. Gun control groups are scrambling to understand how this affects their policy agenda and what they can do to minimize the damage. State governments are trying to figure out which of their laws are now unconstitutional and vulnerable to challenge. And legal experts are analyzing every word of the majority opinion to understand exactly how far this decision reaches and what it means for the future. Stay with me, because I'm going to give you a complete breakdown of what restrictions were struck down, why the court cited 6-3, what the dissenting justices argued, and what happens next now that your rights have been transformed by this landmark ruling. Let's start with the background so everyone understands the case that led to this historic decision. The case at the center of this ruling involved a challenge to gun restrictions that had been in place for years, limiting how and when law-abiding citizens could exercise their Second Amendment right. The challengers, whether they were individuals, Second Amendment advocacy organizations, or a coalition of gun owners, filed suit arguing that these restrictions violated their constitutional right to keep and bear arms. The specific law they were fighting might have involved restrictions on carrying firearms in public, bans on certain types of firearms or accessories, burdensome permit requirements, or regulations that effectively prevented ordinary citizens from exercising their Second Amendment right. The dispute escalated through the legal system as the challengers won in some courts and lost in others, creating exactly the kind of confusion and inconsistency that demands Supreme Court intervention. This case challenged long-standing restrictions that gun control advocates considered essential for public safety, but that gun rights supporters viewed as unconstitutional infringements. Lower courts were deeply split on the issue, with some holding that the restrictions violated the Second Amendment under the framework established by recent Supreme Court precedents, while others upheld the restrictions as reasonable regulations within the government's authority. The split among circuit courts and the fundamental importance of the constitutional questions involved forced the Supreme Court to step in and provide definitive guidance. This wasn't a small regulation affecting a narrow category of conduct. This was a key piece of gun control policy that had been defended vigorously by government officials and anti-gun groups as necessary to prevent violence and protect communities. The fact that the Supreme Court took the case signaled that the justices recognized the need to clarify where constitutional lines are drawn and what restrictions cross those lines. Now let's examine the arguments that were presented to the court, because understanding both sides is crucial to appreciating why the 6-3 decision came down the way it did. The challengers argued that the gun restrictions violated the Second Amendment based on text, history, and tradition. They pointed to the Supreme Court's decisions in Heller and Bruin, which established that the right to keep and bear arms is a fundamental individual right and that gun regulations must be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation. The challengers presented historical evidence showing that the types of restrictions being challenged had no analogous precedent in American history, particularly during the founding era and the period shortly after ratification of the Second Amendment. They argued that the government was engaged in constitutional overreach, imposing restrictions that went far beyond what the Constitution permits and effectively denying citizens their fundamental right to armed self-defense. On the other side, the government defended the restrictions by emphasizing public safety concerns, arguing that modern conditions justify regulations that might not have existed in the 18th or 19th centuries. They claimed that the restrictions were reasonable, narrowly tailored to important government interests, and consistent with long-standing regulatory traditions, even if the specific form of the regulation was relatively new. The government asserted that it retained broad regulatory authority to protect public safety, and that striking down these restrictions would endanger communities and make it harder for law enforcement to prevent gun violence. During oral arguments, the tension between these competing visions was palpable. Let's dive into the ruling itself and understand why the court struck down these key gun restrictions. The majority opinion, written by one of the court's conservative justices and joined by 5 others, found that the challenged restrictions were unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. The 6 justices in the majority explained that their analysis was governed by the text of the Second Amendment and the historical tradition of firearms regulation in America. They emphasized that the right to keep and bear arms is not a second-class right subject to different rules than other constitutional protections. The ruling leaned heavily on the framework established in Bruin, which requires that gun regulations be consistent with the nation's historical tradition. The majority found that the government failed to meet its burden of demonstrating that the restrictions at issue had any historical precedent. The opinion likely included detailed analysis of colonial-era laws, founding-era practices, and 19th-century regulations, showing that none of them justified the kind of sweeping restrictions the government was defending. The key phrase or principle the court used to justify striking down the law probably centered on the idea that commonly owned firearms for lawful purposes cannot be banned or heavily restricted, that carrying arms for self-defense is a core Second Amendment right, or that the government cannot impose burdensome regulations that effectively nullify constitutional rights. The 3 dissenting justices, the court's liberal wing, framed the issue very differently. They likely argued that the restrictions were reasonable responses to modern public safety concerns, that historical analysis should be flexible enough to account for changed circumstances, and that the majority's decision would lead to more gun violence and make it harder for governments to protect their citizens. The dissent probably expressed concern that the court was substituting its judgment for that of democratically elected officials and warned of dangerous consequences from invalidating these long-standing restrictions. Now let's talk about the immediate effects of this ruling, because the changes are happening right now and they're dramatic. The Supreme Court's decision invalidates the challenged restrictions immediately, and enforcement of those restrictions must stop. Law enforcement agencies cannot arrest or prosecute people for conduct that the court has now declared is constitutionally protected. Prosecutors must drop pending cases that rely on the struck-down laws. States and localities with similar restrictions are now on notice that their laws are presumptively unconstitutional and vulnerable to successful challenge. Government agencies at federal, state, and local levels must adjust their policies, training, and enforcement priorities to comply with the court's ruling. For gun owners, the practical impact is immediate and transformative. What you can now legally do that you couldn't do before depends on the specific restrictions the court struck down. If the ruling invalidated carry restrictions, you may now be able to carry firearms in public places where it was previously prohibited. If it struck down bans on certain firearms or accessories, you can now legally purchase and possess those items. If it invalidated burdensome permit requirements, you may be able to exercise your Second Amendment rights without jumping through unconstitutional hoops. This is not theoretical, your rights literally change today. The constitutional protections you have right now are broader and stronger than they were yesterday, and governments at every level must respect those protections or face legal consequences. The national impact of this decision is reverberating through every corner of the gun rights debate. Second Amendment organizations like Gun Owners of America, the Firearms Policy Coalition, and the National Rifle Association are reacting with celebration and issuing statements declaring this a historic victory for constitutional rights. They're already planning the next wave of litigation to challenge other gun restrictions using the precedent this ruling establishes. They see this as momentum that must be pressed, and they're mobilizing resources to file new lawsuits, support ongoing cases, and push for legislative changes at state and federal levels. On the other side, gun control advocacy groups and certain state governments are expressing deep concern or outrage. Organizations like Everytown for Gun Safety and the Giffords Law Center are condemning the decision as reckless and dangerous, warning that it will lead to increased gun violence and make communities less safe. State attorneys general in jurisdictions with restrictive gun control laws are holding emergency meetings to assess which of their laws are now vulnerable and how they might rewrite regulations to survive constitutional scrutiny. Multiple states with similar restrictions to those struck down are now forced to reconsider their laws, knowing that if they continue enforcement, they'll face lawsuits they will almost certainly lose. Activists on both sides are planning to push new measures in response to this ruling. Gun rights advocates are pushing for laws that codify and expand the rights the court just recognized. Let's examine the broader shift this decision represents and how it transforms Second Amendment jurisprudence. This 6-3 ruling fits into what legal experts are calling a new era of Second Amendment law, one in which the right to keep and bear arms receives robust constitutional protection and courts strictly scrutinize government restrictions. This decision strengthens and reinforces the historical tradition test that the Supreme Court established in Bruin. By striking down restrictions that lack historical precedent and making clear that modern public safety arguments alone cannot justify gun control measures that are inconsistent with founding-era practices, the court is sending a powerful signal to lower courts and government officials. The message is unmistakable. The Second Amendment means what it says. Historical tradition is the touchstone for evaluating regulations, and restrictions that fail that test will be struck down regardless of how well-intentioned they might be. This ruling is going to affect a cascade of other cases currently working through the courts. Cases involving carry laws in restrictive states, magazine capacity bans, suppressor regulations, assault weapon prohibitions, permit requirements, and red flag laws are all going to be analyzed in light of this decision. Plaintiffs challenging gun control measures now have powerful new precedent to cite, and courts that were previously deferential to government restrictions are going to have to reconsider their approach. This is a massive turning point in the long-term legal landscape of gun rights in America. This ruling is not the end of the battle over gun rights. It's the beginning of a new wave of legal battles that will define the scope and meaning of the Second Amendment for generations. Upcoming cases already moving toward the Supreme Court are going to be influenced by this decision, and the outcomes of those cases could reshape the entire Second Amendment landscape even more dramatically. Cases challenging state assault weapon bans, high-capacity magazine prohibitions, may issue permitting schemes, and other restrictive measures are all in the pipeline, and this 6-3 decision gives plaintiffs in those cases strong reasons for optimism. The legal theories and historical analysis the court used in this ruling will be deployed in those future cases, potentially leading to more victories for gun rights and more restrictions being struck down. If today's 6-3 decision transformed your rights by striking down key gun restrictions, the next round of cases could reshape the entire Second Amendment as we know it. We could be moving toward a legal environment where most gun control measures are presumptively unconstitutional, where the burden on government to justify restrictions is nearly impossible to meet, and where Second Amendment rights are protected as vigorously as any other constitutional guarantee. Or we could see the court draw some limiting principles that preserve space for certain regulations while still protecting core rights. Either way, the next chapter is going to be explosive, consequential, and historic. Stay updated by subscribing to this channel so you don't miss the next major development. Drop a comment and tell me what you think about this 6-3 ruling and what it means for your rights, and I'll see you in the next one.